Welcome to Hood Politics. In today's episode, we will be discussing Good Burger versus Mondo Burger, the story of West Covina's deadliest beef. This all takes place in 1997 when a new restaurant called Mondo Burger opened up right across the street from Good Burger. The rivalry between Good Burger and Mondo Burger was sparked by Mondo Burger's founding member, Kurt Boswell's desire to put Good Burger out of business and prove that his restaurant, Mondo Burger, is superior. Kurt's aggressive tactics included sabotage and using the triamphethol chemical to make his burgers unnaturally bigger, suggests that he was motivated by a competitive spirit and a desire to dominate the West Covina fast food market. However, prominent Good Burger members, Ed and Dexter, were determined to stop Kurt and expose his plan, which only seemed to add fuel to the fire, sparking a tense rivalry between the two restaurants. This story really all begins in the early summer of 1997. Dexter Reed had just gotten out of his last day of school and was ready to enjoy his summer vacation. Unfortunately, while joyriding in his mother's car, he had gotten into a car accident and had to get a summer job. Dexter had originally applied for a position over at Mondo Burger, but for an unknown reason, he was removed from the training and subsequently did not get the job. Jobless and with the payment looming over his head, Dexter Reed went across the street to Good Burger and decided to drown his sorrows in some milkshakes as he brainstormed what he would do to pay off his debts. It was there he was offered a job by none other than prominent Good Burger member, Ed. Originally, Dexter Reed wasn't all that enthused about taking the job, but it was when he saw a pretty girl named Monique that his mind suddenly changed. Dexter eagerly accepted his new position as a delivery driver. He got introduced to the Good Burger crew, and within the same 10 minutes he got the job, he was already out on his first mission, making deliveries alongside Ed. On their first delivery together, they delivered burgers to a customer using Ed's wild driving style behind the wheel. After the delivery, they returned to the restaurant and the vibe was upbeat because they just pulled off the delivery in Ed's chaotic but effective style. Back at the restaurant, Dexter and Ed were chilling behind the counter when Good Burger OG, Mr. Bailey, came out and said he was pleased with their delivery hustle because it was starting to draw attention to Good Burger. Customers were coming in and the place was really starting to pick up some steam. This set up the contrast with the looming threat of Mondo Burger, the shiny new competitor across the street. Across the street, OG Kurt of Mondo Burger and his crew were plotting to crush Good Burger. Kurt was shown hyping up his oversized burgers and scheming to undermine Good Burger's growing popularity. This is where the rivalry really started to heat up, as Mondo Burger's flashy operation overshadowed Good Burger's mom and pop vibe. Mondo Burger was making cash hand over fist. It seemed like an unstoppable force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, over at Good Burger, business really started to dry up. Customers barely came in, giving the Good Burger crew plenty of time to plot and scheme their next moves. Late one night, Good Burger OG Mr. Bailey came into Good Burger and told his staff that he had obtained a Mondo Burger and he was going to see what the hype was about with his crew. OG Mr. Bailey put the Mondo Burger on the counter, and the entire Good Burger crew was utterly stunned at the size. But Good Burger's prayers would soon be answered. One day, while Ed and Dexter were having lunch together, Ed shared his homemade secret sauce. Dexter loved it so much, he called the rest of the Good Burger crew over. After everybody tried Ed's sauce, they all loved it and realized that this could be what saves Good Burger. Pretty soon, they introduced Ed's sauce to the menu. Business started booming again, and Good Burger was back on top. Across the street, Mondo Burger OG Kurt Boswell was plotting and scheming on Good Burger's downfall, watching them succeed while boiling in jealousy. Kurt Boswell had come up with a plan to send a female to go on a date with Ed and set him up. Ed, Dexter, and the setup female whose name was Roxanne would all go on a double date. They went to a miniature golf course and played golf together. It's believed that Ed assaulted Roxanne by hitting her with his golf club and somehow getting the golf ball to hit her in her forehead, knocking her out. They returned to Good Burger later that night where Dexter and Monique would leave Ed and Roxanne alone in the car. After being left alone in the car, it's believed that Ed and Roxanne got into an altercation where Ed would end up body slamming Roxanne onto the floor. A few days later, Ed and Dexter had lunch together behind the Good Burger building where a stray dog approached them. They thought the dog was hungry and tried giving the dog a Mondo burger. For whatever reason, the dog didn't want the Mondo burger, but would happily eat the Good Burger. This made the duo incredibly suspicious, and they decided to go and investigate. Ed and Dexter would end up dressing like some old ladies and going to Mondo Burger, asking for assistance finding the women's restroom. While the employee was distracted, they snuck into the kitchen, and what they found was shocking. They found out the reason why the Mondo Burgers are so big is because they were using an illegal chemical called triamphethol. Kurt Boswell would end up catching Ed and Dexter sneaking around a Mondo Burger, and he would use his connections to send them to the Demented Hills Insane Asylum. Later that night, Kurt Boswell and some members of the Mondo Burger crew would sneak into Good Burger to put shark poison in Good Burger's food supply. It was there when a Good Burger OG, known as Otis, caught them in the act. Unfortunately for Otis, Kurt Boswell would use his connections to get him sent to Demented Hills as well, where he would regroup with Ed and Dexter. They would end up forming a brilliant escape plan where Ed and George Clinton would start a dance party in the psych ward, and while the guards were distracted, Dexter would knock two of them out before jumping out of a window. They would end up stealing an ice cream truck and getting chased by a Demented Hills van. It's reported that to escape, Ed started throwing ice cream out of the back of their ice cream truck, and that gave them the opportunity to give the Demented Hills van the slip. Ed, Dexter, and Otis would all arrive at Good Burger right as it opened, where Ed tackled an elderly lady as she was about to take a bite from a burger. Ed and the elderly lady got up, but Ed and Dexter had no time to explain, and they hurried across the street to Mondo Burger and left Otis to explain everything to the Good Burger crew. Ed and Dexter would end up sneaking over into Mondo Burger once again. They would do this by climbing onto the roof of a nearby truck and climbing onto the roof of the Mondo Burger building before dropping down into a chimney. Upon entering the building, Dexter would end up confronting the Mondo Burger staff in the kitchen, taunting them and leading them on a chase, distracting them while leaving Ed to his devices. However, instead of taking the triamphethol for evidence, Ed thought it would be wise to dump all of the triamphethol Mondo Burger had into all of the Mondo Burgers, because he realized that because of the corrupt judicial system in America, even if he did bring a full bottle of triamphethol to the proper authorities, it would ultimately prove fruitless due to Mondo Burger's tight hold and deep connections with local law enforcement and judges. Not to mention they could afford an expensive lawyer, and even if they were proven guilty, they more than likely wouldn't get nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And that's not even going into how long these types of court cases usually take. Ed would end up regrouping with Dexter on the roof while he was cornered by Mondo Burger staff. He proudly showed Dexter a can of the triamphethol, however it was empty, causing the Mondo Burger staff to laugh in their face. However, the Mondo Burger staff greatly underestimated Ed's secret genius. Little did any of them know this was all part of Ed's master plan to bring down Mondo Burger once and for all. Suddenly, explosions started going off inside the Mondo Burger kitchen. The cause was from Mondo Burger's oversized burgers suddenly popping due to all the triamphethol that Ed poured in. The explosions caused earthquake-like effects in the Mondo Burger restaurant, leaving patrons to all run in panic out of the restaurant as decorations and lights fell onto the floor. OG Kurt Boswell and some of the Mondo Burger crew entered the kitchen in an attempt to stop the chaos. Unfortunately, the chaos was just too much to handle, and they also fled the restaurant. This would eventually culminate in OG Kurt Boswell of Mondo Burger to be placed in handcuffs and put in the back of a West Covina Police Department patrol car. Ed and Dexter jumped at the opportunity to taunt Kurt Boswell as he was sitting in the back of the patrol car. Ed and Dexter would both return to Good Burger, being hailed as heroes. And that brings us to the conclusion of Good Burger versus Mondo Burger. the story of West Covina's deadliest gang beef. In the end, about 3 people were injured in the Mondo burger collapse, and Kurt Boswell was ultimately sentenced to 30 years at the San Quentin Penitentiary.